Hello and welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. I'm Tony Watkins, Fellow for Public Engagement here at Tyndale House. And today I have to be on my best behaviour because Peter Williams, our principal, is the person that we're talking to. So hi Peter, good to have you with us.
Good to be here.
And we're going to be talking about the history of Tyndale House because this is a very significant year for us, being our 80th anniversary. So let's start at the beginning of Tyndale House history and the conversations that were happening before the Second World War began. What was going on in the late 1930s and why were people beginning to think that we needed somewhere like this?
Yes, well, obviously I wasn't around, although I have talked to some people who were around at the founding of Tyndale House. And we have the history of the first 60 years of Tyndale House written by Professor Tom Noble, and that gives you some of what we can say. But it does seem that before the war, there is a real dearth in serious evangelical scholarship, particularly in Britain, but also worldwide, and that evangelicals are not well represented in the universities at all. And this is really key. So what was being classed as liberal theology, and that can mean different things in different eras. But certainly back then, very important would have been the denial of the supernatural in practical terms, in terms of what it was doing in the Bible. Very negative views, often towards how the Bible arose. That was being in the university mainstream and even in Bible colleges. And there was a sense that we need to do something to address this. And so it's really in 1938 that John Wenham and a group of friends get together and decide they need to start a group of evangelical scholars. And then it's in the middle of the Second World War where an actual decision is made to found a biblical research library, which is also residential. And a couple of really key players in that are Broughton Knox, who was involved in founding the George Whitfield College in South Africa, also became principal of Moore College in Sydney, Australia, very much entrepreneurial in terms of wanting to buy property and believing in the residential side. The great scholar behind it was W.J. Martin, who was involved later in the New International Version and was a lecturer in Semitic languages in Liverpool University. And those two folk came together and the property was purchased in 1944 and really opens its doors, January the 3rd, 1945, with Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones giving an address there. And so those are sort of key moments. Other people involved would be G.T. Manley. Famously, in I think it was 1893, he came top in Cambridge University in maths when Bertrand Russell came sixth. And so that's quite sweet. And he chaired the group that decided to form Tyndale House. Oliver Barclay, who headed up the InterVarsity Fellowship, which then became the Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship.
Not that he wasn't heading it up at that point, surely.
No, but he was just a young man. Yeah. But he came to do that later, but was part of the Barclay banking family. Yeah, right. Hears that some of his cousins are selling the property we're currently in, and so he's able to put them in touch with that. So those seem to be some of the key players. And then some of the people that we think of as the first generation actually come along just a little bit later. People like F.F. Bruce, Norman Anderson, and Donald Wiseman, for instance. Right. They're really in after the decisions to open things have been made. Okay,
let's just go back a little bit. You mentioned John Wenham in that initial group of people thinking about it, but John Wenham must have been a very young man at that point.
Yes,
surely.
Absolutely, a theological student. Now, he became famous later on because he wrote what became the standard Greek textbook, at least in the UK, for learning Greek. Now, there are so many textbooks now that simply writing a textbook won't make you famous, but there were so few back then that Wenham almost became synonymous with this. And then, of course, I mean, he had, I think, 5 children, but someone out there can correct me on this. But key for our point of view is that he has 2 two sons who then go on to be really influential in their own right. Gordon Wenham as an Old Testament scholar, David Wenham as a New Testament scholar. So in a sense, the Wenham family had a massive influence in biblical studies over the coming years.
So you may not be able to answer this, but why was such a young man, and there were others involved as well, but why was he so captivated by this vision? And who else was involved in those initial discussions?
Sure. I mean, another person who was consulted was a man called Basil Atkinson.
Oh, yeah.
Now, he was the head librarian at Cambridge University, and he owned a property along Grange Road, which is the big 1 mile long road that we're just next to, and was willing to have things start in his property.
I see.
So that was another thing that was being considered. And he was a Greek expert. So there certainly were other, significant players at the time. I can't necessarily come up with all the names. And one of the interesting things for me as I look back in the history of Tyndale House is just how many individuals were involved at every stage. Some of them become better known names and some of them aren't.
Yeah, right. And Tyndale Fellowship was started as well in order to address this need.
Yeah, so in some senses, the fellowship precedes the house. So although recently the Tyndale Fellowship is now an independent charity, and it was Tyndale House which formed that charity and helped it become independent, the order historically is reversed. It's the fellowship first and then the house. And I think that's important because institutions need to come out of movements. Just trying to form an institution without the movement doesn't work. So you've already got to get the movement hot of saying we need to do something about getting evangelical Bible scholars. And when that movement is beginning to get hot, then the institution helps, institutionalize, it helps solidify the intentions multi-generationally. And that's really what's gone on there. And so we're the beneficiaries of that.
Yeah, right. Why were those initial people who were so determined to address this need of the lack of evangelical scholars, why did they think it was so important not just to have a library, but to have a residential library?
Well, I think the idea always was to mentor and shape people and recognizing that things happen in community. Now, one inspiration for that was there was a former British Prime Minister, famous Welsh Prime Minister of Great Britain, who called William Gladstone. And he actually had a big personal library, and there is now his personal library, the Gladstone Library, in North Wales, and people had visited that and been impressed by what was going on there, a wonderful residential library. And so that idea had gone forward. And I think the beauty of it is, of course, because we as an institution aren't involved in awarding degrees, we're not involved in, if I can say, the academic treadmill or rat race or whatever we want to call it, about trying to get in people's money through fees and get them qualifications and so on. It means we're not in a rival relationship with any of them. And so I think it was a very good long-term vision that said we can help people anywhere who are able just to come here for a short time. And so the idea was that people here short term or long term. Of course, it was all just in this one house we're sitting in now, which is a sort of 8-bedroom house, so a substantial house, but not absolutely, enormous. And that limits the number of people. But it was the idea that you work with these small numbers and grow from there. And I think that's very forward-looking. I do think the founders might be surprised by how far things have gone.
I'm sure.
And part of that is, I think the founders have a national vision, not an international vision.
Right.
And it's hard to foresee that what will happen with transatlantic flight becoming really quite affordable and travel, just international travel becoming so much easier, that people from around the world would come, that the UK would become one of the main places educating people theologically and in biblical studies for the world. So people are coming from the entire world round here, and UK has a disproportionate impact. I mean, partly through the English language, but also through the institutions we have here. And so there has been that sort of impact, which is really incredible. And there are other aspects of it. For instance, evangelicals become rather poorly represented in the really elite US colleges, the Ivy Leagues. They can be so well endowed, they don't even need to take students. And so it became a possibility for people to come over, for instance, from the US to here, do a PhD at a good university, Oxford, Cambridge, Aberdeen and other places, and go back there. And so then what we look at the next generation, we have people like F.F. Bruce, and he's founds the Biblical Studies Department in Sheffield, and people are able to study with him, or to go to Liverpool and study with Alan Millard or Kenneth Kitchen, or to go to Aberdeen and study with Howard Marshall. And these become great opportunities for people over time. And again, it'd be hard for the founders to foresee that sort of international impact, which happens particularly, I suppose, from the 1970s onwards as the travel becomes easier.
Yeah, right. Although there were at the early Tyndale Fellowship conferences, when they set up the New Testament and Old Testament study groups, there was American and Australian representation in both of those.
Absolutely.
But it was that's something that grew much more as time went on.
Yeah, and I think in the 1950s, we're still hearing of them travelling by ship. You see.
Yeah, right.
You know, so they're sailing from Australia, and that's just there is that big difference that flight makes.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the significant things that have happened in Tyndale House over the 80 years that we've been going?
Well, I think one of the biggest things has been people forming connectivity in relationships in the library and over coffee and all these sort of things. So it is that connectedness that's happened at the core of evangelical biblical studies. How many PhDs have been done here? Well, is it 400? I mean, it's difficult to put an exact number on. It's certainly an awful lot. And so each of those people has gone on to have an impact. You can then look at Bible translations that have been affected through that. You can look at our journal, the Tyndale Bulletin. You can look at I think just the confidence that people have been given that evangelicals can be really serious about the Bible and that the church can have confidence in the scriptures.
Yeah. Small beginnings then in the 1940s with that determination that evangelicals could make a difference in the academy and be better trained for the church and so on. But it was a big ship to try and turn around in a sense because liberalism was so dominant. How I mean, maybe this is hard to say, but how long did it take before what was happening at Tyndale House began to have some kind of a turning influence?
Well, I think it begins in small ways. And it's always difficult to unpick what any one institution has contributed. Sure. And I think that's where we just need to be careful. I mean, clearly things like the Billy Graham Crusades in the 1950s were incredibly used by God in terms of raising people's awareness of the gospel. And there have been many different things that happen. But what we can say is Tyndale House has been right at the centre of the revival of evangelical biblical studies. Now, of course, there have been other points where that's been happening, and it's lovely that this happens around the world. It's not just happening in one place. But when we consider someone like Leon Morris, who did his PhD at Tyndale House, he later came back to lead Tyndale House as its warden, but he went on to become Australia's best published theologian. And so what does that mean in Australia? Your best published theologian, was someone who was here, and you look at all the things that he wrote and the effect of that. I mean, for many years, Carson, Moo and Morris was a particular introduction to the New Testament was very influential. Leon Morris's commentary on the Gospel of John influenced many preachers, and you can't. How do you reckon up on the influence of that? So that's where I would just say there clearly has been a very big influence. Sometimes we could look at it and say, well, look, the first draft of Kings in the New International Version was done by Donald Wiseman. He spent time at Tyndale House. In fact, Donald Mary Wiseman's ashes are in the garden here at Tyndale House. Or the first draft of Proverbs by Alan Millard. for the NIV, but also the work on the ESV that was done here at Tyndale House in the Upper Hexagon. All these sort of things. How do you compute that influence? I don't really know.
Yeah.
And I'd want to be careful that we're not trying to speak too much in comparative terms. This has had more effect than that. But just to say that it's been part of the tapestry of what God's been doing. And perhaps also to say that even though we're a relatively small institution, there's been nowhere where there's been as big a concentration of the top end of evangelical Bible scholars than here.
Right.
And that's been an amazing thing to see. And so when you've been kicking around Tyndale House for close to 35 years, as I have been, you get to meet quite a number of these people.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary place to be. Just thinking of the people who, when I was a young man and beginning to read commentaries and so on, the names that I was reading then. Oh yeah, but this is where so many of them worked and operated.
And if we can get on to later history, I mean, when I was first introduced here through Eugene Merrill.
Right.
Now, Eugene Merrill was absolutely key in the Dallas Theological Seminary Old Testament faculty, and then I met Harold Honer, who was really the key person forming the New Testament faculty there, and recruited a lot of his colleagues, and they were both people who were passionate about Tyndale House, and Harold had done his PhD here in Cambridge, and so that then has a whole influence on that particular institution. One person who spent 9 years of his life cumulatively at Tyndale House was D.A. Carson. Well, D.A. Carson goes on to found the Gospel Coalition along with Tim Keller. So you have this huge influence. I mean, we've got the two big study Bibles, the ESV Study Bible and the NIV Study Bible. What's in common? Well, the lead editors are both Tyndale House people. They both did their PhDs in Cambridge University, but based at Tyndale House. So D.A. Carson for the NIV Study Bible, Wayne Grudem for the ESV Study Bible. Was it 2.5 million words for the NIV, I think, and it's 2 million for the ESV. And then they're, of course, drawing on their connections of who they've met, so many of them meeting them here, for who they get to contribute to those. And so, again, that's just another wonderful story.
Yeah. When Tyndale House was first set up, it was part of InterVarsity Fellowship, as it was then called, which then became Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship. So the UK student movement within the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. How significant was that being part of IVF, then UCCF? And I mean, that came... Tyndale House was separated off in 2015.
2015, yeah.
2015.
Well,
So,
I think very significant. And you read in the early history about the Tyndale Fellowship meeting in New Zealand and Australia and Canada and all this international movement, because the InterVarsity Fellowship movement, of course, we got the InterVarsity Press nowadays in North America, was very connected. You know, the UK, Canada, the US. And so it's lovely to have that sort of heritage. Now, what's happened over time is different organizations have drifted apart socially. And part of that, of course, there are just more people on the planet. There's more going on. Very natural tendencies. But to know that sort of common stock that you came from, that namely historic evangelicalism, non-denominational evangelicalism that loves denominations. It's really great to have denominations. It shows that people care about things, but is also prepared to set those things aside, some of the things that divide us, for something even greater, namely reaching the world with the gospel. And you don't want a Bible translation just to be for a particular denomination. You really know this needs to be something that's more general, and that's something that we've seen has happened. And
I mean, that's from my first visit to Tyndale House in 2014, I think, it was clear to me that there was that same conviction that there is a core of an evangelical understanding of what the Orthodox historic Christian faith is, and it would be centered on that, but not with a tight boundary that was policed.
And I think a key issue there is that it doesn't mean we're not passionate, even about our secondary divisions.
Sure.
So, we can have two people can come to Tyndale House and they can write passionately a defense of infant baptism or of believers only baptism. I mean, as in, and that can go on here.
Yeah.
And we pray a blessing on both of them. And then, and that's a lovely situation to be in. And it's not, privately, we're not going to say, we might sympathise more with this and that. But
sure.
that we are really properly committed to historic general evangelicalism, and we want to unite people around that.
Yeah. Has the emphasis on biblical studies always been the emphasis? I
think absolutely. Now, of course, there are people have always had wide interests. Our first librarian, arguably, is Andrew Walls, who, of course, became a lead missiologist and student or scholar of worldwide Christianity today. Our first warden, Sir Norman Anderson, was an expert on Islamic law.
Yeah.
And so we've had people who've had interest in other things, and that's, again, wonderful. So we still have people who are not working in biblical studies. I was talking to a couple of church historians earlier today. We let some of them in. They want to drink up the atmosphere. But at the same time, recognizing that, look, if we're really passionate about the Word of God, then we need to be studying it. It's in original languages. And if you want to know about theology, again, you've got to get to that bedrock of what the scriptural text says. And so we would love there to exist parallel institutions in philosophy and historical theology and history. These are a great thing, and we'd love that to happen here in Cambridge. But we also want to focus on what we focused on. Now, the Tyndale Fellowship has had this wider remit, and definitely encourage people to go to the website there. That's now an independent charity, but it's got study groups, Old New Testament, biblical theology, but also history of doctrine and philosophy of religion, for instance, is another one, practical theology, where they've got other areas that come together and study. And it really needs to happen. We need to get people together so that they're able to encourage each other and share resources, share knowledge, and help each other along. So we are very keen as an institution that's managed to survive 80 years and even grow under God's blessing, to share everything we know with those who would want to replicate this in other areas or even replicate it in other countries. So, I do think that we're sitting in a good position next to an 800-year-old university in English-speaking country where, so far things are pretty peaceful in relative terms, but there is... people have set up institutions with some of the same ideas. For instance, there's a Finnish Bible Institute in Helsinki and so on. But it's unlikely that lots of people are going to be, traveling there to see that from outside Finland. So that's where we very much want to work alongside other institutions.
Yeah. And that international flavour of Tyndale House has always been important, but has become increasingly important over the years. Tell us a little bit about the international scholars who come here.
Yeah, well, just before that, on the international flavour, when you look at the history of leadership of Tyndale House, the leaders in the past, Murray Harris from New Zealand, Leon Morris from Australia, my predecessor, Bruce Winter from Australia. We've often had, leadership from outside the UK, and we have, for many years, sponsored people from different countries to come in. And just going back a long time, David Sumura from Japan was a lead on one of our Old Testament projects, the Genesis Project. He's one of the key researchers on that. But he then went back to Japan and led the new Japanese Bible translation. So that's always gone on. But now in recent years, really since about 2014, we tried to grow a program to equip more scholars from what we call majority world. Some of those countries that are less theologically enriched. They may have very strong churches numerically, but they don't have the resources in their language or the number of theological educators. So one of our first attempts was actually working with Cubans, and we brought over one, and I think we brought over 3, then 10, and then 6. And we just brought over groups, and we were working in this room, teaching them biblical languages. And we had one of our trustees who's totally fluent in Spanish, teaching them Hebrew in Spanish, teaching them Greek in Spanish. And you might say, well, why would you do that? Why would you bring people to Cambridge to do that? Well, the answer is, in their home context, they are trying to feed their families. They're living tough lives, and people are knocking on their door all the time, trying to, get them to do things, help them, and so on. If you take them out of that, they're actually able to study. Now, to study a language, you've got to learn tables of verbs, tables of nouns, just memorizing stuff. You cannot have the luxury to do that when you're having to preach every Sunday and so on. So we found bringing people out of their context for maybe 2 months was enough time in order for them to get the leisure to study, and they would drill very hard. And over several of these visits, they were able to get to a point where they were really very good and they were competent, they were sustaining it. And then they started teaching others in Cuba. And this is snowballed. We've been trying to do something similar, a bit with Brazilians, a little bit with Egyptians. And so we're very keen on trying to help each different context with their bespoke syllabus, in a sense, where we bring some of our experts together and say, what are we able to offer you that's going to help your context and help you to get further ahead? And again, our aim is to get them so they can study independently, do PhDs, and become theological leaders, but not to do that to one person in a culture, but to do it to a cohort. So then, hopefully they're not going to get big-headed and think, I know a lot, because there's a whole group of them. They keep each other accountable. They can, joke, laugh at each other, and hopefully no one's going to take themselves too seriously because they've only got a PhD. No, it's just, PhD is not a big thing. Just get it and move on and do some ministry. So that's been the philosophy, and we've got tremendous opportunities growing that, and we're soon going to have more space here at Tyndale House to have people come and do that. So that's really exciting. Yeah.
Let's talk about the space thing, because we've focused on what we're about, which is important. So you mentioned earlier that originally it was just the 1908 house. Yep. Was the library in this room originally?
Yeah.
I always assumed it was, but I'd never clarified that. Yep. So just this 8-bedroomed house, and then there was an expansion in the 1950s to build a library extension that was expanded in the mid-80s. Was it 85?
That's right, in mid-80s, and then there's a further expansion in 1992, where there's an extension to what was the Warden's Lodge, and a conversion of that so that there's family housing, and then a new lodge built. So, and then we acquired another property in 2021. And we are still, looking to just grow the residential space. And then right now we're in the middle of, hopefully this year, beginning to build a new library. So all of those things happening. And yes, a lot of what we do is constrained because we don't have enough space to bring the size of groups we'd like to here. But by God's grace, it has been steadily growing, so that if we weren't in the middle of a building project, we could reasonably expect there to be a minimum of 40 people staying overnight at Tyndale House, and lots more people on the ground during the day, and that's certainly we'd hope I'd hope to be getting to at least 100 people here every day,
right.
Rather soon. So
yeah, just very briefly tell us about the library building project. Many people watching this will have, or listening to it will have heard something.
So
just an outline.
It's something we've been looking forward to for a very long time, planning for decades, really. But replacing our current library, which doesn't really have weight-bearing walls, that you can't just stack more and more books in there. It's 2 stories with something that's 4 stories, and it goes from about 7,000 feet to close to over 20,000 square feet. And everything will be so much better in terms of the desks able to adjust to standing, as which some people like to do in their desks nowadays. Very well lit, more space for books because we acquire books at quite a rate, and better living accommodation where it's actually designed so that people can live more in community, not just in their own room like a cell, but more something. The rooms are more comfortable.
Monastic cell, not prison cell.
Yeah, that's right. Things are designed to try and achieve the spiritual aims we want, so that they won't be getting together. We'll have a lecture theatre, a chapel where we're able to invite people from the outside. Everything will be, very friendly for disabilities. And so on. And so that's what we're looking forward to. And God's been very gracious in providing supporters for that. But, if anyone wants to keep helping, of course, they're very welcome. We always, the whole thing right from the beginning has been run largely on donations. But that's just something we haven't even talked about, the financial aspect of there was a builder right at the beginning of Tyndale House who gave 1/3 of the funding to buy the plot. The plot is now worth about 2,000 times what it was bought for, that £4,500 it was bought for. And just people keep investing.
Yeah.
And it's been... I get to see donations that come in, and just the number of stories I cannot tell you because people are just donating anonymously, and it's beautiful to see that, and not always who you think would be giving that, and that's just the beauty of being in my position, seeing that.
Yeah, and then one sentence, 2 sentences, maybe just as we close. What are your dreams for? What would you like to see happen?
Well, what I'd really like to see is just more people raised up to be evangelical Bible scholars. I think of someone like D.A. Carson, the remarkably gifted people. I just love there to be so many people like him. Everyone, different temperaments and so on. I think of someone like John Lennox, not in biblical studies, but in another area, as a public intellectual who's able to be winsome and talk about the faith in public. And I would love there to be more of that. Not just for the UK, but for every language group, every country. So why can't there be those sort of people for Spain, for Portugal, for Albania, and so on? That's what we would love to see. Whole cohorts of them, not just one individual. So you're saying, who shall we invite to speak? Oh, it's the same list. There's only a limited number of people. That doesn't make any sense. We want a whole culture to be raised up.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Peter. It's great to chat to you about this. There's so much more we could talk about. Do make sure you sign up for our newsletter if you're not already subscribed. Get Inc. magazine that we publish on a regular basis. Well, in print twice a year in the UK, digitally 4 times a year. Find out about the library rebuilding project and how you can support us. There's lots of ways that you can get involved, whether you're a biblical scholar or not. So please do connect with us, pray for us. There's a lot of exciting things going on and have done over the years, and will continue to do so. Thank you so much, Peter. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.